In 1963, a young man named Robert Moog was a student at Cornell University. And like most students, he needed some spending money. When he was a kid, Moog had entertained himself by building various electronic projects at his house, including an instrument he had read about in one of his project magazines, which was a theremin. Moog was selling theremins out of his dorm room for $50 a pop and had managed to sell about 1,000 of them, earning quite a reputation for building great-sounding, reliable instruments. He was approached by a musician named Herb Deutsch, and Herb had a proposition for Moog. He suggested that Moog embark on building a synthesizer. Now keep in mind that the synthesizers of the day were things like the RCA Mark II and Mark I, giant room-sized hot contraptions that were incredibly complicated to work with and wouldn't reproduce music in real time. In 1964, Moog gets to work on this project, and at the same time, also in 1964, another guy named Don Buchla is working on a similar project, but they're coming at it from very different angles. Buchla is interested in making truly modern instruments. They're going to reproduce interesting new sounds and aren't necessarily going to be connected to a keyboard. They may have entirely different means of controls. Maybe it's just knobs. Maybe it's waving your hands in the air. The point is, he's trying to develop a brand new instrument. Moog, on the other hand, is interested in hooking up an organ keyboard to his synthesizer so that anyone who can play piano can play the synthesizer. Both of these instruments are designed for performance and immediacy. It's important to note that both Moog and Buchla are working with musicians to try and make their instruments as musician-friendly as possible so that real people will use these things. One thing that Buchla has that Moog doesn't at the time is something called a sequencer. And this is a little box that lets you type in or program notes ahead of time so that you can accompany yourself or have the synthesizer play parts that are impossible for humans to play. By 1966, Moog has a product and some interest, but not a whole lot of sales. People are looking at his instrument and they're not really sure what to do about it. If it's going to work, is it reliable, is it even musically useful? Both of these guys, Moog and Buchla, realize that in order for their instruments to take off, they have to show people how useful they are as musical instruments. So, Buchla hires a guy named Morton Subotnik, who he's been developing the synthesizer with, to write a piece for the Buchla synthesizer. Subotnik's piece is called Silver Apples of the Moon, and it uses all of the features of the Buchla synthesizer extensively, especially this sequencer. Silver Apples of the Moon is a very weird sounding record full of strange tonalities, different keys, all sorts of things like that. It sounds like music from Mars. But things really happened for Moog in 1968 when a young man named Walter Carlos brings out a record that changes music forever. In 1968, Walter Carlos releases a record called Switched on Bach. This record on the cover has some guy made up like Bach standing in front of a giant Moog synthesizer. The record itself contains Bach pieces performed by Carlos on the Moog synthesizer. But he's not using the Moog to sound like some weird space-age instrument. He's trying to use the Moog to emulate as closely as possible the instrumental sounds of the orchestra. The record hits the charts in 1969 and goes on to be one of the biggest selling classical records of all time. Overnight, the Moog synthesizer is legitimized as a musical instrument. Everybody wants one, and as fast as Moog can build them, they're flying off the shelves. Everybody seems to realize that this record represents two very important things. One is that a single person can be an entire orchestra using a synthesizer and a tape recorder. The other is that the synthesizer is capable of reproducing almost any sound, from the weirdest sounds of the future to very convincing imitations of flutes, clarinets, and strings. At long last, modern technology has caught up with Thaddeus Cahill and his telharmonium. One of the clever things about these synthesizers is that they're modular. They consist of a bunch of little boxes that you connect together with cables. So one box might generate the basic timbre of a sound, another might let you control its duration, and another might let you control its amplitude. All of the characteristics of sound we discussed can be modified using different knobs on a synthesizer. The synthesizer also offers almost limitless ways of connecting these things up, and at first, traditional musicians are terrified. String players are worried that they're never going to get hired again, since their job can now theoretically be done by one person using a synthesizer. But when you listen back to the recordings of the day and hear what a real string sound according to these synthesizer people sounded like, it's laughably far from anything resembling a real string. Yet people were legitimately concerned about no longer getting gigs. As I said, one important development is that a single person could replace an entire orchestra. And the synthesizer is everywhere. Pop musicians are using it because all rock music thrives on novelty and new sounds. And here is the newest sound of them all. It's plastic, it's easy to work with, it's of the future, it's of the moment. The synthesizer is arguably the most important invention in the history of 20th century music. And isn't it ironic that the thing that brings it to that state, that turns it into the building block of most avant-garde composition, is Bach? Bach, who arguably created all of the rules that composers had been trying to break in the 20th century.